Before the United States existed, 13 British colonies stretched along North America's eastern seaboard, each one a foothold in a vast and unfamiliar land. These settlements, clustered between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains, were the seeds of a new society, planted under the watchful eye of the British Crown. People crossed the ocean for many reasons, seeking religious freedom, the promise of land, or simply a fresh start. Over time, each colony developed its own unique character, shaped by its founders, geography, and the dreams of those who called it home. In Virginia, tobacco fields fueled prosperity and shaped society. Massachusetts was built on Puritan values, community, faith, and hard work. Pennsylvania, founded by Quakers, became a haven for tolerance and religious diversity. Each colony, while British, was also distinctly itself. Colonists traded raw materials, tobacco, timber, furs, for British goods like textiles and tea. They felt both English and independent, connected to the empire but also forging their own way of life on the edge of the wilderness. Local assemblies and town meetings governed daily life, giving colonists a taste of self-rule and a voice in their own affairs. These early experiments in democracy planted the idea that government could be by the people, not just for them. As colonists built homes, churches, and schools, their independence grew. They solved their own problems, organized their own communities, and learned to rely on one another in a land far from the king's reach. The British Empire protected its colonies and profited from their success, yet, the vast Atlantic Ocean created distance, not just in miles, but in mindset. Over time, this separation fostered a spirit of self-reliance and a sense that the colonies were something new. After the costly French and Indian War, Britain emerged with new territory, but also staggering debt. The empire's reach had grown, but so had its burdens. King George III and Parliament turned to the colonies, expecting them to help pay for the empire's defense and expansion. They saw the colonies as prosperous and secure, thanks to British protection. To British officials, the colonies were thriving, rich farmland, busy ports, and growing towns. Surely, they reasoned, these colonists could shoulder some of the empire's costs. The decision to tax the colonies, through measures like the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, would change everything. For the first time, colonists felt the heavy hand of distant rule in their daily lives. Colonists, long accustomed to managing their own affairs, bristled at the idea of Parliament making laws and levying taxes without their consent. Debates erupted in taverns and town halls as people questioned what it meant to be both British and American. The seeds of conflict were sown as Britain demanded more from its American subjects. Tensions simmered and trust began to erode. The promise of America, opportunity, self-reliance, and a voice in government, suddenly seemed at risk. Colonists wondered if their hard-won freedoms would survive. The British expected loyalty and payment. The colonists expected respect and autonomy. Neither side was willing to yield. This clash of expectations set the stage for a dramatic confrontation, one that would shape the future of a continent. The world was changing, and the colonies were about to change with it. Old traditions would be challenged, and new ideas would take root. The next chapter would be written not by kings or distant rulers, but by ordinary people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and families, determined to shape their own destiny. The collision course was set. The struggle for America's future was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. To pay its mounting debts from years of war, Britain imposed a series of new taxes on the American colonies, without ever asking for their consent or input. These taxes were not just a financial burden, they were a stark reminder of the colonists' lack of political power. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to buy official stamps for newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards, touching nearly every aspect of daily life and business in the colonies. Colonists had no representatives in Parliament. Their voices and concerns were completely ignored by lawmakers thousands of miles away. Taxation without representation is tyranny became their rallying cry, echoing through town meetings and public squares across the colonies. The issue wasn't just about the money, it was about the fundamental principle of self-government and the right to have a say in laws that affected their lives. Colonists believed only their own elected assemblies had the legitimate authority to tax them, not distant lawmakers in London who knew little of colonial life. The British claimed virtual representation, insisting Parliament represented all British subjects, but colonists firmly rejected this idea as empty and meaningless. How could someone in London truly understand the needs of a farmer in Georgia or a fisherman in Massachusetts, separated by an entire ocean and a world of experience? For the colonists, representation had to be local and direct, rooted in their own communities and responsive to their unique challenges. The Stamp Act became a visible daily reminder of lost rights and growing resentment, fueling anger and protests throughout the colonies. The foundation of the British Empire in America was beginning to crack, as trust and loyalty eroded with each new law. The colonists' demand was simple: an equal voice in their own government and the right to decide their own fate. The refusal to grant this basic right would push the colonies ever closer to open rebellion and, ultimately, revolution. British taxes and trade laws hit every corner of colonial society. Merchants in cities like Boston and Philadelphia faced stricter regulations and shrinking profits. Farmers paid higher prices for goods and struggled to sell crops as merchants suffered. Everyday items, tea, glass, lead, became more expensive, fueling shared anger. The proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachians, felt like betrayal to those seeking new land. Colonists saw their futures limited by distant rulers. Grievances spread from city docks to rural homesteads. The sense of powerlessness united colonists across class and region. Discontent was growing, and so was the desire for change. Colonists didn't accept British laws quietly. They resisted. Boycotts of British goods became widespread, with women leading the way by making homespun cloth and herbal teas. Groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty organized protests and intimidated tax collectors. Effigies hung from the Liberty Tree, and some officials were tarred and feathered, a brutal warning to others. Pamphlets and fiery speeches, like those from Patrick Henry, spread radical ideas. Words became weapons, uniting scattered protests into a movement. The conflict was shifting from debate to confrontation. Protest was now both practical and symbolic. Americans were forging their own identity. The British found it harder to enforce their laws. The colonies were learning the power of collective action. The seeds of revolution were taking root. The 13 colonies were once strangers, divided by distance, language, and culture. Each colony had its own traditions, leaders, and way of life, and many saw themselves as separate from their neighbors. But British policies and new taxes forced them to find common cause. The imposition of laws from across the ocean made colonists realize their shared struggles. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 marked their first united stand, as representatives from different colonies gathered to petition the king for their rights and protest unfair taxation. Committees of correspondence soon spread news and coordinated resistance, creating a network of unity that reached from New England to the southernmost colonies. Events like the Boston Massacre fueled outrage and a sense of shared fate, as colonists saw that what happened in one town could affect them all. The First Continental Congress in 1774 brought delegates together in Philadelphia to organize a boycott, demand change, and debate the future of their relationship with Britain. An attack on one colony was now seen as an attack on all, forging a powerful sense of solidarity among the people. The colonies were no longer isolated. They were becoming a single movement, united by purpose and hope for a better future. Differences faded as the threat grew, and people from all walks of life began to work together for a common cause. The idea of American unity was born in the fires of resistance, as protests and acts of defiance spread from town to town. The stage was set for collective action, and leaders began to plan for the challenges ahead. The colonies were ready to stand together, determined to defend their rights and their future. The path to independence was opening, and a new nation was beginning to take shape. As conflict deepened, the idea of liberty took hold. Inspired by philosophers like John Locke, colonists believed in natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Britain's actions felt like a direct attack on these rights. The American experience, freedom from old-world constraints, made liberty personal. The language of freedom spread in sermons, pamphlets, and public symbols. Liberty became the unifying cause, worth fighting and dying for. The contradiction of slavery emerged as some colonists called for abolition. The revolution planted seeds for future struggles for equality. The Declaration of Independence would soon give these ideas a voice. The dream of liberty was now a movement. In 1773, the Tea Act reignited colonial anger. Cheap tea with a hidden tax was seen as a trick to force acceptance of British authority. In Boston, Governor Hutchinson refused to let tea ships leave without unloading. Tensions mounted as the deadline approached. On December 16th, Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawks, boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was a bold, organized act of defiance. Protesters targeted only the tea, making their message clear. News of the event outraged Britain. The destruction of property was a direct challenge to British rule. The time for compromise was over. The fuse of revolution was lit. The colonies had crossed a point of no return. Britain responded to the Boston Tea Party with the Intolerable Acts, punishing Massachusetts and closing Boston's port. Colonists saw this as a threat to all their liberties, uniting them further. The First Continental Congress organized a boycott and urged militias to prepare. Minutemen drilled across New England, ready for conflict. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched to seize weapons in Concord. Paul Revere and others warned the countryside. "The British are coming!" At Lexington, a shot rang out. The shot heard round the world. Fighting spread to Concord, and British troops retreated under fire. The American Revolution had begun. Ordinary people stood against a powerful empire. The colonies were now at war for their rights and their future. The struggle for independence was underway. There was no turning back. Lexington and Concord turned protest into war. The Second Continental Congress became America's government, appointing George Washington as commander. The fight was now for freedom, not just rights as Englishmen. Thomas Paine's common sense convinced many to seek independence. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence proclaimed the colonies free and equal. Its radical ideas inspired revolutions worldwide. The American Revolution was a struggle for self-government and liberty. It began with protests, grew into unified resistance, and became a war for a new nation. The revolution proved ordinary people could win their freedom. Its legacy endures in the idea that people can shape their own destiny. In 1775, the American colonies simmered with tension, their streets and homes filled with uncertainty and fear. The air was thick with rumors, and every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question: what would Britain do next? For years, Parliament imposed taxes on paper, glass, tea, without colonial representation. These taxes weren't just financial burdens, they were daily reminders that the colonists' voices were ignored by a distant king and government. Each new law felt like a chain, tightening, eroding freedoms, and fueling a growing sense of injustice. The colonists felt their rights slipping away, one decree at a time. British soldiers, the redcoats, patrolled colonial streets, fueling resentment. Their presence was a constant reminder of British control, and their red uniforms became symbols of oppression. Boston became the epicenter of resistance, led by men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. These leaders inspired others to question authority and organize against injustice. Boycotts and protests escalated, culminating in the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped British tea into the harbor. This bold act of defiance sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Britain retaliated with the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port, stripping local power, and sending more troops. These harsh measures were meant to crush dissent, but instead, they fanned the flames of rebellion. Instead of isolating Boston, these acts united the colonies. Delegates from across America gathered, realizing their shared struggle. Colonists realized that oppression in one colony threatened them all. News of British crackdowns spread quickly, forging a sense of common purpose. The sense of injustice grew into a shared resolve. Ordinary men and women began to see themselves as part of something larger, a movement for liberty. The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. Tensions reached a boiling point, and the colonies braced for what was to come. The colonies stood on the brink of open rebellion, militias trained in secret, and every town prepared for the possibility of war. The British underestimated the unity and determination forming across America. They saw only scattered protests, not the birth of a revolution. The seeds of revolution had been sown, and the first sparks were about to ignite. The desire for freedom was now unstoppable. The world would soon witness a struggle for liberty, as ordinary people prepared to risk everything for a chance at self-determination. The fate of an empire, and a new nation hung in the balance. The choices made in these tense days would echo for generations. The American Revolution was about to begin, and the world would never be the same. On the night of April 18, 1775, British General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, secretly ordered nearly 700 British regulars to march out of Boston. Their mission was to seize colonial weapons and gunpowder stored in Concord, and to arrest prominent Patriot leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be hiding in Lexington. The British hoped to crush the growing rebellion before it could ignite into full-scale war. But the colonists were vigilant. Dr. Joseph Warren, a key figure in the Patriot movement, quickly dispatched Paul Revere and William Dawes to ride through the night and warn the countryside of the British advance. Revere's legendary midnight ride was signaled by 2 lanterns hung in the steeple of the Old North Church, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, alerting the Patriots that the British were coming by the Charles River. Church bells rang out across the villages, and Minutemen, ordinary farmers and tradesmen, trained to be ready at a minute's notice, began to gather their arms and assemble. As the first light of dawn broke on April 19th, 77 local militia, led by Captain John Parker, stood nervously on Lexington Green, determined to defend their town. They faced an overwhelming force. Hundreds of British redcoats, professional soldiers, now stood across from these farmers and shopkeepers who had never seen battle. British Major John Pitcairn rode forward and ordered the colonists to disperse and lay down their arms. Captain Parker, knowing his men were outnumbered, told them, "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Suddenly, a single shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but it shattered the tense silence. The British soldiers opened fire, and chaos erupted on the green. The American Revolution had begun in earnest. The shot, heard round the world, shattered the uneasy peace, echoing far beyond Lexington. The British pressed on toward Concord, but the alarm had spread. The countryside was awake, and armed men were gathering from every direction. The first blood of the conflict had been spilled on Lexington Green. For the colonists, there was no turning back now. The colonies were now at war with the world's most powerful empire, and the struggle for independence had truly begun. News of the skirmish spread rapidly, by word of mouth, by broadsides, and by riders galloping from town to town. The events at Lexington would soon echo across continents. Ordinary people, men, women, and even children, had taken a stand against the might of empire. The world was watching, and history was being made. The fight for American independence had begun, and the spirit of resistance would only grow stronger in the days ahead. The stakes had never been higher. The revolution was no longer just talk. It was now a reality, with lives and futures hanging in the balance. The British would soon learn the true cost of colonial resistance, as the fighting spread and the resolve of the patriots hardened. The road to freedom would be long, uncertain, and bloody, marked by sacrifice and courage on both sides. The first battle was over, but the war for liberty had just begun. The world would never be the same. The clash at Lexington was brief, but it marked a turning point in history. In the early morning light, tension hung thick in the air as colonial militiamen faced off against the might of the British Empire. The exchange of gunfire lasted only moments, but its impact was explosive. 8 colonists lay dead. Their sacrifice would echo far beyond the village green. The British pressed on to Concord, unaware they'd awakened a hornet's nest of resistance that would soon engulf the countryside. The alarm spread rapidly. Riders galloped from town to town, and church bells rang out, summoning thousands of militiamen from their homes and fields. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial forces gathered their courage and confronted the British with determination. Shots rang out once more. This time the colonists fired back with resolve, refusing to yield. The redcoats, outnumbered and rattled by the unexpected resistance, began a hasty retreat. The march back to Boston became a gauntlet. Militiamen fired from behind trees and stone walls, turning every step into a deadly challenge. The British suffered heavy losses, with nearly 300 killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the day. The colonists had proven their resolve and shown the world their willingness to fight for their beliefs. They fought not as a formal army, but as determined citizens, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers defending their rights and their homes. Guerrilla tactics and local knowledge turned the British retreat into chaos as the countryside erupted in defiance. The myth of British invincibility was shattered in a single day, replaced by uncertainty and fear. The countryside was ablaze with rebellion as villages rallied and the fires of revolution spread. The revolution was no longer a distant idea. It was a living fighting force, embodied by ordinary people taking extraordinary risks. The world watched as Americans stood up for their freedom, sending a message that would echo across continents. The British realized this would not be an easy victory, but a long and costly struggle. The war for independence had truly begun, and there would be no turning back. The colonies would never be the same. A new chapter in history had opened, written in courage and sacrifice. After Lexington and Concord, Boston was under siege by thousands of colonial militiamen. The British, trapped in the city, planned to seize the high ground of Bunker and Breed's Hill. On June 16, 1775, colonial troops fortified Breed's Hill overnight. At dawn, the British attacked in force. Twice, the Redcoats charged and were driven back by devastating colonial fire. Prescott's famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." On the third assault, the colonists ran out of ammunition and retreated. The British took the hill, but at a terrible cost, over 1,000 casualties. The colonists lost the ground, but won a moral victory. They had stood up to the world's strongest army. The British learned that this rebellion would not be easily crushed. The revolutionaries had proven their courage and resolve. As the siege of Boston continued, colonial leaders met in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. The scattered militias needed unity, a true army. Congress created the Continental Army on June 14, 1775, transforming local fighters into a national force. They sent the Olive Branch petition to King George, hoping for peace, but prepared for war. The colonies were acting together for the first time. The decision was radical, a step toward nationhood. The search began for a commander who could unite and lead this new army. The fate of the revolution would rest on his shoulders. The American cause was now truly united. Congress chose George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief. Washington's experience and southern roots symbolized unity among the colonies. He arrived at Cambridge to find a disorganized, poorly supplied force. Washington imposed discipline, established a chain of command, and began training the men. Supplies were scarce, morale was low, and enlistments were short. Washington's leadership inspired respect. He shared hardships and demanded order. He worked tirelessly to forge a real army from a ragtag militia. The siege of Boston dragged on, and Washington knew he needed a victory. Washington's resolve would be tested by hardship and uncertainty. The Continental Army was taking shape, but the odds were daunting. The revolution's success depended on Washington's ability to unite and lead. The world watched as America's fate hung in the balance. The next move would determine the future of the colonies. The struggle for independence was just beginning. The first winter tested the Continental Army's endurance. Soldiers faced cold, hunger, disease, and a desperate shortage of supplies. Many lacked shoes and proper clothing. Morale plummeted. Gunpowder was scarce. Washington's army could barely fight. Enlistments expired, and men considered leaving. Washington pleaded with them to stay, appealing to their sense of duty. Shared hardship forged a core of determined soldiers. The winter's suffering would harden the army for the trials ahead. In January 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, electrified the colonies. Paine argued for independence, attacking monarchy, and calling King George a royal brute. His words reached ordinary people, making the case for a new nation based on liberty. Common Sense spread rapidly, read in taverns and army camps. It transformed public opinion. Independence was no longer radical, but necessary. The pamphlet united colonists behind a common cause. The idea of America as a free nation took hold. The revolution gained a new sense of purpose. Inspired by common sense, the Continental Congress moved toward independence. In July 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. Its words proclaimed equality and listed grievances against the king. On July 4th, Congress adopted the Declaration, a bold act of treason. The signers risked everything for the promise of liberty. The colonies were now the United States of America. The war would continue, but the goal was clear: freedom. A new nation was born, founded on the radical idea of liberty for all. Before the first shots rang out, a storm was quietly gathering strength across the 13 colonies. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, as ordinary men and women went about their daily lives, unaware that history was about to change forever. For generations, colonists had seen themselves as loyal English subjects, proud of their heritage and traditions. But after the costly 7 Years' War, the British government, deep in debt, imposed new taxes and regulations on the colonies, measures that would alter the relationship between Britain and America forever. Acts like the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts taxed everything from newspapers to tea, touching nearly every aspect of colonial life. Yet, the colonists had no voice in Parliament, sparking outrage and fueling the powerful slogan, "No taxation without representation." Protests erupted in towns and cities as colonists began to question the authority of the Crown. The arrival of British soldiers, in cities like Boston, only heightened the sense of injustice. Tensions boiled over into violence, most notably in the Boston Massacre, where blood was spilled on colonial streets. Soon after, the Boston Tea Party sent a defiant message across the Atlantic, as colonists dumped British tea into the harbor in protest. Outraged, Britain responded with the intolerable acts, closing Boston's vital port, stripping local governments of power, and placing Massachusetts under harsh military rule. These punitive measures were meant to crush resistance, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of dividing the colonies, the crackdown united them. Leaders from different regions began to correspond, share ideas, and organize. For the first time, colonists from New Hampshire to Georgia saw their struggles as one and the same. The fate of Massachusetts became a warning to all. If the British could close Boston's port and silence its people, no colony was truly safe. Fear and anger spread, but so did a sense of shared purpose. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They debated, argued, and ultimately agreed to stand together, demanding the restoration of their rights and liberties. Though they weren't yet calling for independence, the delegates forged a new sense of unity. They pledged to resist what they saw as tyranny and to defend each other if attacked. Across the colonies, militias began to drill and prepare. Ordinary people, farmers, merchants, artisans, readied themselves for the possibility of war. The colonies stood on the brink, united, defiant, and waiting for the storm to break. The revolution was about to begin, a struggle that would reshape not only the colonies but the world itself. In the spring of 1775, the air in Massachusetts was thick with tension and anticipation. The countryside, usually peaceful and green, now buzzed with rumors and fear. People whispered of British soldiers, of secret meetings, and of the possibility that war was coming to their doorsteps. Local militias, known as Minutemen for their readiness to fight at a moment's notice, gathered on village greens, drilling with muskets and preparing for the worst. They stockpiled arms in barns and cellars, convinced the conflict with the British was no longer just a distant threat, but an imminent reality. When British General Thomas Gage ordered his troops to march on Concord to seize colonial supplies, the alarm was raised. Paul Revere, along with other riders, galloped through the night, lanterns shining in the darkness, spreading the urgent warning, "The regulars are coming." The countryside was roused from sleep, and farmers grabbed their muskets. At dawn, on Lexington Green, colonial militia faced off against British soldiers. Tension hung in the air, and then, suddenly, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but that single gunshot shattered the uneasy silence and changed history forever. The British soldiers unleashed volleys of musket fire, leaving 8 colonists dead on the green. The redcoats pressed forward, determined to complete their mission, but the cost of blood had already set the colonies ablaze with anger and resolve. In Concord, the colonial militia struck back with determination, firing from behind stone walls and trees. The British, caught off guard by the colonists' fierce resistance, were forced to retreat under relentless musket fire, their ranks thinning as they fell back. The march back to Boston turned into a desperate, chaotic retreat for the redcoats. Colonial marksmen harried them all the way, turning the countryside into a running battlefield. Exhausted and bloodied, the British barely made it back to safety. These were not just isolated skirmishes, they were the opening battles of a revolution. The world would soon know that the American colonies had taken up arms against the might of the British Empire. News of the fighting spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed urgent headlines, town criers shouted the news in village squares, and riders carried word from town to town. The shot heard round the world echoed far beyond Massachusetts. The time for petitions and peaceful protest was over. The colonies had fired on the king's troops, and there was no turning back. The people now faced a stark choice: submit or fight for their freedom. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened in urgent session. Delegates debated fiercely, knowing they must now raise an army and choose a leader to guide them through the storm of war that had begun. The American Revolution had begun. There was no turning back. The colonies were at war, and the fight for independence had truly started. By the summer of 1776, the American colonies had been at war with Britain for over a year. The fields and forests echoed with the sounds of marching boots and distant gunfire, as the Continental Army endured hardship and uncertainty. Tents dotted the landscape, and the air was thick with anticipation and anxiety. Yet, despite the sacrifices, the ultimate goal of the conflict remained unclear for many. The dream of freedom was still just that: a dream, not yet a reality. Many colonists, torn between loyalty to the crown and hope for a better future, still clung to the possibility of reconciliation with Britain. Families and neighbors debated fiercely in town squares and taverns, uncertain about the path ahead. But then, a pamphlet began to circulate. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Its words electrified the colonies, reaching farmers, merchants, and soldiers alike. Paine's arguments were bold and direct, urging Americans to break free from monarchy and embrace self-government. His plain, powerful language changed minds and stirred hearts, making the idea of independence seem not only possible, but necessary. In June, the debate reached a turning point. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood before the Continental Congress and proposed a radical resolution that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Declaring independence was a perilous act, an open challenge to the might of the British Empire. Every delegate knew that signing such a document was an act of treason, punishable by death. To put their vision into words, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian inspired by Enlightenment thinkers, took the lead. Jefferson wrote by candlelight, drawing on the ideas of liberty and equality. He declared that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that their most sacred duty is to protect the rights of the people. On July 2nd, after intense debate, Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted Jefferson's Declaration, forever changing the course of history. As the news spread, the Liberty Bell rang out in Philadelphia, its peal echoing the hopes and fears of a new nation. The United States of America was born, not from ancient lineage or royal decree, but from a revolutionary idea that all people are created equal and deserve a voice in their own government. The world watched in awe and disbelief. Monarchs and commoners alike realized that the old order was being challenged, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Across the colonies, the Declaration was read aloud in public squares. Cheers erupted, and celebrations began, but so did a new sense of responsibility and danger. Now, the colonies faced their greatest test. They had declared their independence, but would have to fight to keep it, on the battlefield and in the hearts of their people. The stakes had never been higher, and the fate of a nation hung in the balance. The Declaration of Independence was more than a breakup letter. It was a bold statement of ideals. All men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It declared that governments exist to secure these rights, deriving power from the consent of the governed. If a government fails, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. The Declaration listed grievances against King George III, justifying revolution. Its words transformed a political dispute into a noble cause, uniting the colonies in pursuit of liberty. The Declaration became America's creed, a promise to strive for freedom and equality. Early in the war, the Continental Army was outmatched, poorly equipped, poorly trained, and facing the world's mightiest military. George Washington knew the colonies needed help. France, Britain's old rival, was the logical ally, but the French hesitated, unsure the Americans could win. Benjamin Franklin went to Paris, charming the French and making the case for American independence. France secretly sent money and supplies, but wanted proof the Americans could win a major battle. The fate of the revolution and the alliance depended on American success on the battlefield. Without French support, victory seemed impossible. The revolution hung in the balance. Even before France officially joined, the American cause inspired individuals like the Marquis de Lafayette. At 19, Lafayette sailed to America, offering his service and fortune. He became a trusted aide to Washington, fighting bravely and enduring hardship at Valley Forge. Lafayette's presence symbolized the global appeal of the American fight for liberty. The turning point came at Saratoga in 1777, where American forces surrounded and forced a British army to surrender. News of Saratoga electrified Paris. Franklin finally had proof. In 1778, France signed a formal alliance, recognizing American independence and sending troops and ships. The war became a global conflict. With French support, the Americans had a real chance at victory. The tide was turning. Saratoga was the war's turning point, convincing France to join the fight. The British shifted focus to the south, capturing Savannah and Charleston, but struggled to control the countryside. American guerrilla fighters and leaders like Nathaniel Greene wore down British forces. Key battles at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse battered the British, forcing Cornwallis to retreat to Yorktown, Virginia. Washington seized the moment, marching south with French allies. The French Navy blocked British escape by sea. Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown. After weeks of siege, he surrendered on October 19, 1781. The world was turned upside down. The revolution had triumphed. The war's end was in sight. The dream of independence was now a reality. America had won its greatest victory. The road to victory was brutal. Soldiers endured hunger disease and bitter winters at places like Valley Forge. What kept them going was hope, the promise of freedom and a better future. Washington's leadership was crucial. His resolve inspired loyalty and courage. Even in defeat, he rallied his men, as at the surprise victory in Trenton. The revolution was a collective effort. Women managed farms, served as nurses and spies, and even fought. Farmers and artisans supported the cause at great personal risk. This shared sacrifice and hope for liberty united the colonies. The spirit of '76 proved stronger than British might. The revolution was powered by ordinary people determined to be free. Their hope changed history. Yorktown's surrender ended major fighting. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 made independence official. The revolution created the first modern republic, inspiring movements for freedom worldwide. America's founding ideals, liberty, equality, self-government, became its guiding star. The struggle to realize all men are created equal would shape the nation's future. The revolution set in motion a continuous expansion of freedom. Against all odds, the colonies built a new nation on hope and principle. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of an idea. The foundation they laid, liberty, self-government, and hope, remains America's greatest strength. In late summer 1781, after 6 long years of hardship, sacrifice, and brutal war, the American colonies stood at a crossroads. The land was weary, scarred by countless battles, and the people's hopes for independence flickered like a candle in the wind. Yet, in this moment of uncertainty, a decisive chapter was about to unfold, one that would shape the destiny of a nation. The fate of American independence hung in the balance, as both armies braced for what could be the final, fateful clash. Tension filled the air, and every soldier knew that the coming days would determine the future of the continent. The Continental Army, battered but unbroken, stood resolute against the might of the British Empire. These men, many of them farmers and tradesmen, had endured hunger, disease, and bitter winters, but their resolve had only grown stronger. General Cornwallis, a seasoned British commander, believed Yorktown to be an impenetrable stronghold. He marched his army into the small Virginia port, confident in his defenses and unaware that he was stepping into a carefully laid trap. Forces were converging from all directions. A powerful French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed for the Chesapeake Bay, not New York as the British had expected, cutting off Cornwallis's escape by sea and shifting the balance of power. Sensing a rare opportunity, General George Washington seized the moment. He and his French allies devised a bold plan that would require secrecy, speed, and flawless coordination. Abandoning their long-held plans to attack New York, Washington and his Franco-American army began a secret, daring march south. Their destination, Yorktown, where the fate of the revolution would be decided. The journey was a remarkable feat of deception and coordination. Thousands of soldiers, along with their French allies, moved swiftly and quietly over hundreds of miles, evading British spies and leaving their enemies guessing. Meanwhile, Cornwallis, confident in his position and the strength of his fortifications, could not see the noose tightening around him. The British camp was calm, unaware that the world was about to change. The destiny of a new nation would be decided at Yorktown. The fields and forests of Virginia were about to witness a turning point in history, as armies gathered and the final battle loomed. The world was about to be turned upside down. The hopes and dreams of millions rested on the courage and determination of those who would fight at Yorktown. The final confrontation was set. History was in motion, and the outcome would echo through the ages, forever altering the course of the American Revolution. The stunning victory at Yorktown, which marked the turning point of the American Revolution, was only possible because of the crucial support provided by France. Without the French alliance, the American struggle for independence might have ended very differently. The partnership between these two nations was not just a matter of convenience, it was a lifeline for the revolutionaries, who desperately needed allies to stand a chance against the might of the British Empire. After the American victory at Saratoga, France saw an opportunity and openly joined the war, transforming what had been a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French involvement meant that the war was no longer confined to the American colonies. It now stretched across oceans, drawing in other European powers, and forcing Britain to fight on multiple fronts. French warships sailed across the Atlantic, and French soldiers landed on American soil, bringing with them hope, experience, and much-needed resources. The alliance, however, was far from perfect. Cultural differences, language barriers, and disagreements over strategy often led to tension between the French and American forces. At times, misunderstandings threatened to undermine their cooperation. Yet, despite these challenges, both sides recognized that their shared goal, defeating the British, was more important than their differences. United by a common enemy, the French brought to the American cause what the revolutionaries lacked and desperately needed: a powerful navy to challenge British control of the seas, professional soldiers trained in European warfare, and vital resources such as weapons, ammunition, and money. French support extended beyond the battlefield, as they also provided diplomatic recognition and legitimacy to the American cause in the eyes of the world. The arrival of French troops and supplies boosted American morale and gave the revolutionaries a fighting chance. The French Navy, in particular, played a decisive role in cutting off British reinforcements and supplies, setting the stage for the final confrontation at Yorktown. Among the most famous figures to emerge from this partnership was the Marquis de Lafayette. Inspired by the ideals of liberty and determined to help the American cause, Lafayette became a bridge between the two nations. His youthful enthusiasm, diplomatic skill, and military leadership helped to strengthen the alliance and foster trust between American and French commanders. French commanders like General Rochambeau brought discipline, expertise, and a wealth of experience to the American forces. Arriving in 1780, Rochambeau and his troops tipped the balance of power, providing the strategic leadership and reinforcements needed to challenge the British on equal footing. Together, George Washington and Rochambeau forged a partnership built on mutual respect and trust. They worked side by side, meticulously planning the decisive trap at Yorktown that would ultimately bring the war to a close. Their collaboration was a testament to what could be achieved when two nations set aside their differences and worked toward a common purpose. The alliance demanded perfect timing and seamless coordination between armies and navies. Every movement, every signal, and every decision had to be synchronized to ensure success. The fate of the revolution depended on their ability to act as one. Now, as the armies prepared for the final confrontation, the partnership would face its greatest test. The hopes of two nations and the future of American independence hung in the balance. The fate of the revolution rested on this partnership, a remarkable alliance that would change the course of history and shape the destiny of a new nation. As autumn arrived, Washington's plan unfolded flawlessly. Admiral de Grasse's fleet blocked the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis from escape or rescue. The British Navy, long dominant, was outmaneuvered and forced to retreat. Cornwallis, trapped on a narrow peninsula, ordered his men to dig in for a siege. By late September, American and French armies encircled Yorktown, forming a semicircle of over 17,000 soldiers. Allied troops dug trenches, inching ever closer to the British lines. The sound of shovels spelled doom for the trapped army. Americans and French worked side by side, their shared labor erasing old boundaries. They were now a single, determined force. The noose tightened. The final act was about to begin. On the evening of October 9, 1781, a thunderous roar shattered the silence as the Allied siege guns opened fire on the British lines at Yorktown. The night sky was illuminated by the fiery arcs of cannonballs, and the ground trembled beneath the relentless barrage. This was not just a battle, it was the overture to the final act of the American Revolution. In a moment that would become legendary, General George Washington himself stepped forward and lit the first cannon, signaling the beginning of the end for British rule in America. His action inspired the Allied troops, uniting French and American forces in a common cause. For days and nights without pause, the Allied artillery unleashed a relentless bombardment. Explosions rocked the British fortifications, sending plumes of earth and debris skyward. The defenders could find no respite as the thunder of guns echoed across the fields, shattering walls and morale alike. French heavy cannons, brought with great effort across the Atlantic, joined forces with determined American gunners. Together, they pounded Yorktown with a precision and ferocity never before seen on this continent, their teamwork a testament to the strength of the alliance. For the British soldiers trapped inside their battered defenses, there was no escape from the storm of iron and fire. Smoke choked the air, and the constant barrage left them exhausted, anxious, and increasingly desperate as their situation grew more hopeless by the hour. Then, on the night of October 14th, the Allies launched a daring and meticulously planned assault on the key British strongholds, redoubts 9 and 10. French troops, braving musket fire and bayonets, stormed one redoubt with courage and determination. At the same time, American soldiers led by the young and ambitious Alexander Hamilton charged the other redoubt. With bayonets fixed and spirits high, they fought fiercely in close quarters, overwhelming the defenders in a matter of minutes. The redoubts fell in less than half an hour, a stunning and decisive success. The victory electrified the Allied ranks and sent shockwaves through the British camp, signaling that the end was fast approaching. With these vital positions now in Allied hands, the siege guns were moved forward to point-blank range. The British found themselves exposed, their defenses crumbling under the renewed and intensified bombardment. The final barrage was overwhelming. British fortifications collapsed, chaos reigned in Cornwallis's camp, and hope for escape vanished. The end was near, and the fate of the British army at Yorktown was sealed. By October 17th, the British position was hopeless. Bombardment had reduced their defenses to rubble, supplies and morale were gone. Cornwallis, seeing no escape, called for a ceasefire. A British drummer signaled parley. The guns fell silent. 2 days later, the formal surrender began. American and French soldiers lined the road as the defeated British marched out. The world had truly turned upside down. Cornwallis, claiming illness, sent his deputy to surrender. The sword was offered to Washington, who directed it to General Lincoln. 1/4 of British forces in America laid down their arms. The war for independence was, for all practical purposes, won. The American Revolution had reached its climax. A new nation stood victorious. Yorktown ended major fighting, but the war wasn't officially over. News of defeat toppled the British government. Peace talks began in Paris. American negotiators, Franklin, Adams, and Jay, faced the challenge of securing full independence and favorable borders. Navigating complex alliances, they boldly negotiated directly with Britain. Their gamble paid off. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States as free and independent. The new nation gained vast territory. From the Atlantic to the Mississippi, the American Revolution was officially over. With independence won, Americans faced the challenge of building a nation. The Articles of Confederation proved too weak to unite the states. Debt, unrest, and division threatened the fragile Union. Leaders like Washington and Madison called for a stronger government. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia and drafted the United States Constitution. It created a federal system, 3 branches, and checks and balances. The Constitution was a blueprint for a new kind of republic. With its ratification, the United States became a functioning nation. The Revolution's promise was given form. The American Revolution was a turning point for the world. It proved a colony could break free and build a republic on liberty and popular sovereignty. The Declaration of Independence inspired oppressed people everywhere. In France, the revolution's ideals sparked their own uprising. Across Latin America and Europe, leaders looked to the American example. The United States became a symbol of self-government and universal rights. The idea that liberty and equality belonged to all humanity spread across the globe. The shot heard round the world kept echoing. The American Revolution story is still unfolding. Its ideals, freedom, self-government, justice, remain relevant today. The revolution was the start of an ongoing journey to fulfill its promise. America's history is a struggle to expand freedom to all. The questions of liberty, equality, and justice endure. Each generation must answer them anew. The dream of freedom forged at Yorktown still inspires. The fight for liberty is never truly over. The legacy of the revolution belongs to all who believe in the power of the human spirit to be free.